Welcome everyone, and welcome to our FIP digital event, Ensuring Quality of Care and Patient Safety through Continuing Professional Development. And it's my pleasure, I am Brett Simmonds, and it's my honour to be Chair of the Pharmacy Board of Australia, and I'm your moderator for tonight's webinar. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm coming from for today's meeting. That's the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, for their continuing connection to land, sea, community and culture, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So it's great to have you all here for our webinar. So we have just a couple of announcements just to make before we get started. So just to let you all know that the webinar is being recorded and is live streamed via YouTube as well. The recording will be available on our website, events.fip.org as well. So if you want to go back and have a look at it again, please feel free. And you can ask questions at any time, but please put them into the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box. And we'll get to them after we finish the presentations tonight. And you're welcome to provide feedback about the webinar as well on our webinars at fip.org as well. And please, you're very welcome to become a member of FIP if you're not already. And please go to their website for us as well. So, without further ado, I just want to talk to you about tonight. So, we're very lucky tonight to have speakers from across the globe, and literally across the globe. We've got a speaker from the USA, from France, and from New Zealand as well. So, we're getting a global view of what ensuring quality of care and patient safety is through continuing professional development tonight. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what the program will be that we're running through tonight. So first off, we'll have a presentation on CPD certification and quality of care, France as a case study from Dr. Carine. She's from France. We'll have a presentation then from entitled My Recert, CPD to Support My Practice, from New Zealand, from Michael Pead and Trish Farrelly. And then we'll have a presentation about the New Mexico Board of Pharmacy CPD experience, and that's from Dr. Joe Anderson. And then we'll have time for your questions and answers, and we'll close off with just to let you know what's happening in the space of FIP moving into the future this year as well. So that's what we've got ahead of us. What we're planning to do tonight is to really give you some information around the overall importance of a mandated CPD program, both from a quality assurance and patient safety perspective. We're going to give you some information about the variations of CPD programs currently in place across various countries, give you an idea of the legislation and regulations in place mandating a CPD program to maintain currency and enhance competence, quality assurance and patient safety. Also give you some information about recertification programs for both specialisation and return to practice, and also another innovative way to ensure quality and currency of pharmacists. So lots to get through tonight, really important. I do want to set the scene a little bit, just to give you an overall flavour of what is happening in a couple of the countries in very quick summary before we get into our presentations tonight. So to give you some idea of what's happening in Denmark, this is around the quality, CPD and certification. In Denmark, there's a compulsory quality system for all Danish community pharmacies. These pharmacists are free to choose the quality system they want, but 80% of them use the accreditation program proposed by the Danish Institute of Quality and Accreditation of Healthcare, and they need to do that every 3 years. And the CPD obligations are also every 3 years, and that's controlled by the Association of Danish Pharmacies. Then moving on to Quebec, and we've got obligations for all community and hospital pharmacies to put in place policies and procedures to achieve standards of practice. So that's important, and these checks are carried out by the Quebec Chamber of Pharmacists. We've got a monitoring program in Quebec that's implemented by the Quebec Chamber to enable pharmacists to look at improving and quality safety around professional practice. And Quebec pharmacists are required to engage in CPD activities and complete at least 40 hours of training, and that's every 2 years. In comparison to that, we look at Switzerland, In Switzerland, there's obligations for all Swiss community and hospital pharmacies to have appropriate quality assurance systems in place. And these checks are checked out every 3 years. And there's also Swiss community and hospital pharmacists are required to undertake continuing education courses every year and obtain at least 200 FPH points. So you can see as we're going through that there's different requirements in different countries around the world. Looking from Switzerland to the United Kingdom, there is no compulsory quality system for English community pharmacists, but a specific yearly pharmacy quality scheme is in place, rewarding pharmacists that achieve quality criteria. To participate, English pharmacies can submit an online declaration every year. And also the pharmacy quality scheme includes various training criteria which change every year. And they're a requirement for UK pharmacists. And moving then on from the UK to Australia. In Australia, we have mandatory registration standards set by the board for general registration, both for initial registration and annual renewal. Pharmacists must declare upon renewal that they meet the minimum requirements around continuing professional development and recency of practice. Adverse declarations are reviewed by the board, and this may require additional requirements for pharmacists, which are then monitored. Practicing pharmacists must complete at least 40 CPD credits every year relevant to their scope of practice. And they're required to assess their competency standards again for pharmacists, reflect on their learning needs, plan CPD to meet those needs, and to keep records of completed continuing professional development training as well. And then the board also audits a subset of pharmacists each year to check on their compliance. And if they're not compliant, it might result in action. So that's very quickly to give you an idea of what is happening in a number of countries around Australia, just to set the scene of what we're looking at now. Going into our presentations, the first of which is from France, and we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Carine Wolf. Carine is the chair of the National Council of French Chamber of Pharmacists. She is a practicing community pharmacist and has been chairing the National Council since July 2017. The Council looks after a body representing 74,000 pharmacists, and they make up community pharmacists, hospital pharmacists, clinical biologists, industrial pharmacists, and wholesalers. Carine has been involved in the regulatory and professional activities of the French Chamber since 2012, first at a regional level and at a national level since 2015. So it's wonderful to have you here, Carine, and I'll hand over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Brett. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me talking about this very important topic. Well, it is important because eventually this is patient safety that counts very much for all of us. And your introduction was very nice, that we can see that many countries have implemented at least something, a kind of program, whether it's mandatory or not, depending on countries. But you can see already that this is something which is really in the mind of many countries to put in place for pharmacists. So I'm going to talk to you today about the program we have in France, mainly for community pharmacists, but also for other pharmacists working in other areas. So CPD in France first, and then I would talk to you about certification, which what you called, I think in your introduction, the recertification. And by the way, that's something which is maybe also interesting to clarify the definition and what we understand behind CPD or behind certification or even behind recertification or another one, accreditation. So this is all kind of different program or system that can coexist for a professional. But let's talk first about CPDs. in France. So CPD for continuing professional development. In France, the system was legally established back in 2009, and it has been a little bit reformed in 2016. It's a legal obligation for all healthcare professionals in France, so not only pharmacists, and it must be, they must be able to prove that they have participated in CPD activities over a cycle of 3 years. So currently we are in the cycle of 2020 up to 2022. And I'm going to come back to this particular cycle later on. So basically CPD requires pharmacists to continually maintain and update and broaden their knowledge and skills, but also to assess and approve and improve their professional practices through their careers. So this is really mandatory. And on the next slide, you can see that this is a national agency called ANDPC, which provides the healthcare professionals some offers to meet this goal, consisting of actions, and these actions and programs, they have to meet a priority national orientation. So coming from the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Health give basically some orientation and priorities for the health, public health, and our program have to fit with this orientation. So we have this national agency, but we have also some other organization that can also provide some action, for instance, for hospitals or for biologists who have also their own quality system they have to fulfill. So to justify their commitment, the pharmacist must complete 2 of the following actions. So it can be either training or evaluation of professional practices and risk assessment, risk management. And at least one of these actions must meet the priority orientation, as I was explaining earlier. On the next slide, you can see that the French chamber is in charge of controlling that pharmacists do fulfill their obligation. So it's a little bit the tricky thing, because even if the system is in place for a long time, it's still difficult for us, the chamber, to get this information and this documentation. So for us as a chamber, it's difficult to fulfill this obligation. So we're improving, but we're working hard with the Ministry of Health so that the national system can provide us with the tools to meet this control obligation. Anyway, the pharmacist must keep on his end record of these CPD activities on a dedicated platform, and that doesn't work very well always, but anyway, that's technical, I would say, issues. But at the end of the day, failure to meet this obligation may be considered as an ethical breach and may have disciplinary and or administrative consequences, like sanctions could be imposed by the disciplinary bodies, like the French Chamber of Pharmacists. So you see, this is a pretty strong obligation, but the problem is, even then, we have some difficulties to have the pharmacist meeting and fulfilling this obligation. Currently, we are at a very low level of pharmacists fulfilling this obligation. Well, obviously, we had this pandemic situation, which has prevent that some pharmacists could meet their training program for the last 3 years. But anyway, this is not the only reason, and it should not be an excuse, but that's the situation, the reality. We have a lot of difficulties for pharmacists to meet this obligation, and I would be interesting to know, maybe in the discussion or in question, how for those of you who are listening in your countries, whether you have 100% of your pharmacists meeting this obligation. Now I want to talk to you about the second part of quality insurance program we have in France, which is very new. It's the certification or recertification. It's, I would say, work in progress, because it's very new from a law which was adopted in July 2019. And we are now currently working with the government to write all the decrees and so on. And it's going to be in place as of 1st of January 2023. So what is certification? It's again for all professional practices, and it's supposed to be in place to have a high level of knowledge for all professionals of care. It's for physicians, for nurses, for dentists, for everybody. So obviously, like CPDs, the French chamber will be in charge of controlling that pharmacists do meet their certification obligation. This will be, this time, a cycle of 6 years and not 3 like for CPDs. On the next slide, I can give you a little bit more of details on this program, even if it's not completely finalized and again, work in progress. But basically, the objective is, again, to update knowledge and skills. So that will be the part of the CPDs that we just seen a couple of minutes ago. So CPDs will be one of the bricks of the certification. But in addition, you will have commitment in quality system developed by public authorities or professional bodies to enhance the quality of their professional practice. So that's the second part. The third part will be patient satisfaction assessment, and this is very new. So that means basically that the pharmacist will have to improve the relationship with this patient, with his patient, and make some kind of assessment on a regular basis to prove that he has improved the satisfaction of patient. And the last one, which is difficult to explain because we don't really know what it's going to be, it's about making sure that the professional himself, like the pharmacist himself, do take care of his own health. I suppose that it comes from the fact that we had a lot of pressure those last years on the health professionals, at least in France. And we've seen a lot of professionals being in nervous breakdown and so on. So, and considering that a health professional who is himself not in good health cannot take care of his or her patient correctly. So basically, I don't know how we would have to prove that or what we would have to do for that. But the idea, as you understand, is to make sure that the patient, the pharmacist himself is in a good health. So basically, this is what we know for the moment about this certification program. So as a conclusion, I can say that CPD systems and certification, on the next slide, you can see the CPD system and certification procedures are interlinked and contribute to the improvement of quality of care in each pharmacy practice setting. I talked a lot about community pharmacy, but we have also for hospitals and for biologists, who have the other program, which is the accreditation. And what is good to remember, it's at the end of the day, this is for the benefit of the patient, and that really which matter. And professional regulators play a very important role in implementing these systems and in ensuring compliance with professional obligation. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Carine. And we'll get to those questions at the end, so we'll bring everyone back together. But thank you so much for a great presentation and helping us learn what's happening in France at the moment, which is great to hear, particularly around that certification program, which you're looking to introduce as well. And I've got to agree with you. I think we as regulators really do play a very important role in implementing and ensuring that pharmacists are held compliant with their professional obligations. I think that's a really important role that we as regulators play. So thank you very much for highlighting that as well. Great to hear from you. Thank you. So now we've got the opportunity. We have a duo team to hear our next presentation, and this is from New Zealand. The presentation is entitled My Research, PD to Support My Practice. And we're very lucky to have both Trish Farrelly and Michael Pead with us. So Michael is the Chief Executive of the Pharmacy Council of New Zealand. Michael brings to the role of Chief Executive a wealth of experience in public sector reform, policy development, regulatory design and application, and education and housing policy development. And this has come about with his experience that he's had both in the New Zealand Treasury, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Ernst & Young Consulting, and is the co-founder of an international consulting practice in New Zealand, Australia and South Africa. The depth of experience in regulation includes economic, social and occupational regulation. He has a Bachelor of Commerce qualification and is a member of the ICANZ and also the Institute of Directors. So great to have Michael with us. We're very privileged to have him with us. And Trish Farrelly. Trish is the Manager of Registration and Competence Assurance at the Pharmacy Council of New Zealand as well. Trish has a diverse range of roles in both clinical and non-clinical practice. And this has given her an opportunity to really positively make a difference to the health and well-being of people, both directly as a practicing pharmacist and indirectly through her work as manager of the intern training program at the Pharmaceutical Society of New Zealand, as pharmacy manager of the New Zealand Ministry of Health, and now as in her current role as manager of registration and competence assurance at the Pharmacy Council. Trish's passion is clinical education and a strong belief that we can improve health outcomes for all New Zealanders through a competent health workforce that is well supported by quality education and professional development programs. So I invite you to sit back now and listen to hear about the New Zealand experience, and over to you, Michael and Trish.
Thanks, Brett. Much appreciated. Tēnā koutou ko Michael Pead toka whenua. He tumuaki aho o te pō whakamana kaimatu o Aotearoa. Hi, I'm Michael Pead, Chief Executive of the Pharmacy Council, and I've just introduced myself in our customary language here in New Zealand, Maori. Trish and I are both going to present, as Brett's alluded to. We're going to cover in our proposed topics, the next slide, we're going to cover the new recertification program. We're going to talk to you about the program in terms of what we have currently and what we have in terms of our new program, which we introduced from the 1st of April 21. We're going to outline why we changed programs. We're going to cover what are the underlying principles, the design principles that we've used to develop our new program. And then we're going to talk briefly how we deal with competence issues and return to practice if people don't meet standards. And finally, we'll conclude with what we see as the benefits of our new program. I'm now going to pass to Trish, slide 3.
I do apologize, Michael. It looks like Ruben lost internet connection. I will try to make sure that I'm sharing my screen. A second, please.
Thank you.
While we're waiting for the slides to come up, I will just introduce myself. As Brett said, I'm Trish Farrelly, and I am the Manager of Registration and Competence Assurance at Te Pau Whakamana Kaimatu o Aotearoa, the Pharmacy Council of New Zealand. And I've been in that role since the end of August 2021, so relatively new role for me. And I'm speaking to you from Wellington, New Zealand, where by now I'd normally be fast asleep. So begging your indulgence with that. Next slide.
And next.
And the next one. Perfect. So I'm just going to set the scene initially. So the Pharmacy Council of New Zealand, we are the body that regulates the pharmacy profession in New Zealand, and we do this under a piece of legislation called the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act from 2003. Now, under this act, the regulatory functions of the pharmacy profession were separated from the professional support functions, and this act actually regulates 21 different health professions in New Zealand. The principal purpose of this act is to protect the health and safety of the public, and to do that through providing for mechanisms that ensure that health practitioners are competent and fit to practice their professions. So in this legislation, it states that the Pharmacy Council as a regulator may set competence and recertification programs. The Act provides examples of what those might look like, but it does not prescribe the form of recertification a recertification program should take. So it's very much up to each of the regulatory authorities to determine what requirements, if any, they will set for recertification. So although it's not mandatory under the Act, CPD has been mandatory for New Zealand pharmacists, for all New Zealand pharmacists, irrespective of where they work, since the mid-2000s. And this most recent change that we have made to our CPD requirements is the third time in around 20 years that Council has set new requirements or revised the requirements. So every year, practicing pharmacists in New Zealand renew their annual practicing certificate on the 1st of April. And at that time, they have to make a declaration that they have met the requirements of the prescribed CPD program. So in terms of our previous program, it ran from 2013 until the 31st of March 2021, and it was a modification of the initial program that we brought in New Zealand. It ran on a 3-yearly cycle. The CPD that was documented was directly linked to competence standards, and it was a point-based system. So Group 1 points were awarded for learning without assessment. Group 2 points were awarded for learning that included assessment, and then we had pharmacists needed to complete 2 what were called Group 3 goals within that 3-year cycle, and they were meant to be more important, more transformative learning goals, if you like, that would really impact on their practice. So in this system, basically time equaled points. So if you think 1 hour equals 1 point, and what it tended to do was very much put the focus on points. So it was all about, the time taken to complete the activity, sometimes perhaps versus the relevance or the value of that activity to an individual pharmacist's own practice. So that was the previous system, and in the next slide, Michael will talk about the new program.
So around 2018, Council started considering a new program. Essentially, we began by evaluating whether the existing recertification program was still fit for purpose? And perhaps more importantly, was it fit for the future, i.e., were our regulatory tools proactive and enabling? As Trish has partially alluded to, there were noises that the then existing program was getting more into a tick box exercise or a point scoring exercise than perhaps necessarily trying to achieve the outcome that we are looking for in terms of our health practitioners. Some of the noise was directed from a delivery perspective, but rightly, we've separated the policy from delivery when thinking about it and designing our new system. What exactly is Council's reason for recertification, and were we meeting right touch regulatory principles were the sorts of things that we tested all the way through in looking at our existing program, as well as thinking about the new. In developing the program, we started with a textbook research methodology, if you like, examining our legislation and understanding exactly what our legislation required, how the current purpose was being met or not, reviewed literature on such tools, examined whether other regulators locally and internationally were doing what they were doing and how they were moving from one regime to another regime, as we're seeing increasingly around the world. We learned there were 4 core elements that we sought in developing a program. 1, professional development activity taken by a pharmacist to maintain their knowledge and skills. 2, verification of relevance and value of selected activities. 3, evaluation of a pharmacist's competence in practice. And 4, verification and evaluations and compliance with those requirements. So we are now in a phased approach of a new program. 2021, or beginning 1 April to 31 March, so 21-22, we asked a reduced broad set of activities to be completed as part of a transition to the new program, and in effect to acknowledge the impacts of COVID in terms of workload on the profession and obviously the time for recording of professional development. We just began the second year from 1 April 22 through to 31 March 23. And in this year, we're now looking for the full set of activities to be undertaken. The next slide outlines the sets of activities for our first year, if you like, and what is the ongoing expectation of requirements. And I'll pass to Trish.
Thanks, Michael. So as you can see from this slide, the reduced requirements are in the right-hand column. The full requirements, which is what every pharmacist will be working towards this year, are in the left-hand column. So we have 6 types of activity. So they're different types of activity. And these activities were chosen because there was evidence to support that they were the types of activities that had a positive impact on competence. So basically, the pharmacists are required, firstly, to create a professional development plan. Now, this can actually be quite a straightforward task, and it's possible for a pharmacist to actually use their development plan from their employment as the basis for this plan. So we're not wanting people to duplicate, but we are wanting there to be a structure to the year. Out of that plan, we'll tip 2 professional development cycles. So these are shorter than those Group 3 goals that you had to complete over, 2 Group 3 over 3 years. Now we're asking people to complete 2 shorter cycles over the 12-month period. They're asked to write a reflective account, and that could either be reflecting on their competence against one of the competence standards or a critical event. And that's, for me, I think the value of pharmacists reflecting critically on their practice, particularly when things don't go right, is a very powerful learning tool. We're also expected, and I say we because as a registered pharmacist, I have to do this as well. We have to participate in 2 professional peer group meetings, and the purpose of that really is to, in some ways, mandate that pharmacists have to be professionally connected with their peers. We all know the evidence shows that professional isolation is one of the things that contributes to errors and increases that risk. So by making it mandatory for pharmacists to engage with their peers, we're wanting to try and avoid that. Pharmacists also have to take an action that contributes towards cultural safety. We are a bicultural nation, and it's becoming increasingly important for health professionals to be able to understand the health inequities for our Indigenous people and do what they can to reduce those. And one of the ways that we can do that is by making sure that we are culturally competent practitioners. The other action is a keeping up to date. And then we have introduced the concept of a verifier. So the verifier, and Michael will talk a bit more about that in a minute, but the pharmacist has to have 2 conversations, or at least 2 conversations with their verifier, and then at the end of the year, the verifier is required to make a statement that says that the pharmacist has complied with the requirements of the recertification. So on the next slide, I think Michael's going to talk a little bit more about that.
So the first part of this slide, the table, sets out the roles of each of the key players in our program, if you like, so the pharmacist, the verifier, and the council. Each of the core, we hope what we most, in terms of the pharmacist, put the pharmacist back in the role of determining what is necessary for professional development to help them be sure that their practice is fit and competent, i.e. they self-assess and determine what is required if a gap exists. The role of the verifier is perhaps the trickiest role to establish. In short, it is a pharmacist who understands the job and the tasks and the pharmacists themselves that they're involved in verifying what work they're doing. The verifier is not legally attesting or providing the assurance of fitness and competence, more just verifying, and there is no liability if there are subsequent concerns. And that's the tricky element that we spent some time here in introducing and helping our pharmacists appreciate and understand that that was not an expectation of the role. The verifier can view the online portfolio. The pharmacist should have a minimum of 2 conversations with their verifier, as Trish alluded to, who can provide feedback, provide that sounding board opportunity, make suggestions, and confirm that learning that the pharmacist is undertaking is relevant to the current role that they're practicing in. So needs to be someone who's very familiar with the pharmacist's practice setting. Council is not looking for a recording of all professional development that a pharmacist may undertake, but rather a window into whether the pharmacist is meeting the requirements at least. Not an assessment per se, but assurance that they are doing relevant professional development. However, we also take a sample of the portfolios and review those on the basis of risk. The bottom part of the table then outlines very briefly what the differences are between our old recertification program, if you like, and the new one that we're now involved in. And I won't, the words speak for themselves on the slide. Over to the next slide. What I thought I'd try and achieve on this slide for you is just further emphasize, and Trish and I have been talking to some of these points so far, is really just emphasizing, so why did we make the change? The goal of the new program was to set annual professional development tasks that better support and enhance the practitioner's skills and knowledge for their own role. As mentioned earlier, it is to be a snapshot or a window of learning that we're looking at, not meant to be everything for council to meet its purpose or legal requirement. So again, the platform that we use or the portfolio that we look at is more just a window into the pharmacist's professional development. Under their competence standard, we expect them to be demonstrating a commitment to lifelong learning. We obviously, as Trish also alluded to a little bit, we obviously then have the option of focusing on particular activities that may have an ongoing criticality and or need to be specifically targeted. There is an activity that is very specifically focused on Indigenous or cultural competence and safety. This is very much a response to helping New Zealand seriously address health inequities and poor health outcomes for Māori and Pacific people. We have made peer groups mandatory, which were not previously, along with the involvement of a verifier to further lift and ensure professional isolation is not a risk. Most fundamentally, we hope the program instills trust back into pharmacists to really own their competence, expectation of lifelong learning, and own what it is they need to maintain their fitness and competence. We trust the practitioner to assess and know their requirements better than anyone sitting in ivory towers. The new program also then naturally required a reassessment and determination of the best way for council to have its recording of requirements delivered and the extent of support offered to the practitioner. A more effective and efficient in-house set of delivery mechanisms have now been employed. In short, a new program that provides us better insurance and better meets our legal requirements. Next slide, please. Underpinning our whole design of this new program, we really followed these 5 principles. So first and foremost, again, putting it very much back in the ownership of the pharmacist, holding the pharmacists accountable for assessing their competence and taking their actions for assuring themselves and council of their fitness and competency. We recognised that we couldn't guarantee pharmacist competence across the range of roles and careers of all practicing pharmacists here in New Zealand. But we recognise that competence is best determined in the context of a pharmacist practice. And we recognise that focusing on practicing pharmacists, those that are patient-facing, would have the greatest benefit to achieving better health outcomes here in New Zealand. And we recognise that any of our requirements must drive competence. Next slide.
So how did we go? As Carine alluded to, onboarding a new recertification system in the midst of the pandemic made us quite popular with the profession. And there were quite a few rumblings. People, didn't like the idea that they had to do something new. They had to get used to a new platform. And at the same time, the Omicron wave was hitting its peak and taking out everything in its path. That said, out of the 4,000 plus practicing pharmacists in New Zealand, there were just 57 that made a declaration that they hadn't met their my recertification requirements by the 31st of March. And I think that was a pretty good result, and it compared to 48 pharmacists at the previous year. So compliance was as good as it had ever been. In terms of those pharmacists who did not meet their requirements by the due date, they were contacted and they were asked when they would be able to meet their requirements, and if necessary were given till the 30th of June. And I'm happy to report that there appears to only be one person who's still outstanding. So all things being equal, that was a pretty good result. We probably I'm just wondering if there's any more to say about that. Maybe we'll just briefly talk about the return to practice process, because Brett alluded to that earlier on. So in New Zealand, if you are returning to practice after a period of time being off the register, it basically depends how long you've been off the register, what your requirements are. So if you are what we call a category 1, which means you've been out of practice for less than 3 years, we ask people to make a declaration of when they last worked, whether or not they have had 450 hours minimum practice in that last in the last 3 years, and if not, to carry out a reflective exercise, basically where they can assess where they think there might be any gaps, and if necessary, we can point them in the direction of relevant CPD, but they're not required to be supervised if they come back to practice over that time. If they're a category 3, which means they've last practiced in the 3 to 8 years, we ask the same questions, but we do also require the pharmacist to be supervised for around 3 months, with monthly reports provided by the supervisor, and also they have to complete a law and ethics interview and a revisit the workplace course. And for anybody who's been away for more than 8 years, they have to do an internship again. So that's a reasonably rigorous 12-month requirement of supervised practice, followed by what we call the assessment centre, which is a case-based OSCE at the end of it. So that's what we do for people who are coming back to practice. Michael, next slide.
And finally, in terms of the benefits of our new system, although we haven't yet, of course, as I alluded to, we're currently in the second year, which is the first year of the full requirements that we're asking. And so we haven't yet conducted a post-implementation review. We will be looking to do one after March 2023. And so it is difficult to be sure how much better the program is, but in time we are confident it will be better, more fit for purpose, and more in tune and appropriate to support a pharmacist, ensuring they are fit and competent. It does put trust back into the pharmacist, and so again supports rather than tries to tell the health practitioner what is best or required to fill any practice-based gaps. They know best. It should also better sit alongside a performance-based employment relationship. Most critically, it trusts a pharmacist to focus on professional development that helps their current practice to achieve better patient outcomes. And from us, that's it. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to us. We do appreciate it. Ngā mihi nui.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much, Trish. Great to have you present. And again, a special thank you for burning the midnight oil for us there in New Zealand. I know how late it is, but it was great to hear your presentation and really interesting to see the new New Zealand framework for reaccreditation. Very, very interesting to see what you're doing in that space, and very innovative, I think, which is great to see. So thank you very much for presenting that and talking to us about some of the compliance issues that you've come across as well. So thank you for that. Just want to highlight a couple of things. One, looking at the chat, it's great to see so many of you introducing yourselves, but also the wide variety of countries that we're covering tonight. It truly is a global event, this FIP digital events, and it's great to see so many people from across the globe joining us. And hopefully you're getting some inspiration and some information about what's happening in different pharmacy organisations around the world. And just a reminder too, that if you've got a question, please put it in the Q&A box. It doesn't have to, you don't have to wait till the end of the presentations. Feel free to put it in there. We will ask them at the end of the presentations, but you can put a question into the Q&A box at any time through the presentations. All right, thank you for that. So now we'll move on. We've been to France, we've been to New Zealand, and now we're going to America. So we're lucky to have with us Dr. Joe Anderson. Joe is currently the Assistant Dean for Curricular Affairs and is an Associate Professor of Pharmacy Practice with the University of New Mexico College of Pharmacy. He has been employed at the university since 1999, and his area of practice is cardiovascular pharmacotherapy. He is licensed as a pharmacist clinician, and he has served 2 terms on the New Mexico Board of Pharmacy. Dr. Anderson served on the Accreditation Council as well for Pharmacy Education's Continuing Professional Development Steering Committee for 4 years. He was also recognised by New Mexico Society of Health System Pharmacists as the Hospital Pharmacist of the Year in 2005, and also was recognised by the New Mexico Pharmacists Association, receiving the Innovative Pharmacy Practice Award in 2008. So, Joe, wonderful to have you with us, and really looking forward to your presentation around the New Mexico Board of Pharmacy CPD experience. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Brett. And I'm very happy to be here with everyone. It's about 6 a.m. here in New Mexico. And what I'm going to do is outline our experience here in New Mexico with CPD. We're in our infancy compared to New Zealand, France, and Australia with regard to CPD. So I just want to kind of talk about what we're doing, and I'll show our journey to get where we are right now. Okay, I just wanted to orient everybody. I'm here in the beautiful state of New Mexico, a multicultural southwestern state. Believe it or not, many people in the United States don't always know that New Mexico is part of the United States of America. It is not part of Mexico. It is part of the United States. With that said, we share a lot of wonderful culture with our bordering country. I live particularly in the city of Albuquerque, which is located about in the central part of north central part of New Mexico. We're known for the International Balloon Fiesta, which occurs every fall. It's beautiful, the world's largest balloon fiesta. I invite everybody to attend. It's every October. But unfortunately, it seems like everybody knows Albuquerque, if they know of Albuquerque or if they know of New Mexico, from a TV show that seemed to be popular a little while ago in the last decade, and that was called Breaking Bad. But I want you to know we have nothing to do with that TV show. All right, so I want to talk about our CPD pilot and why did we ever even initiate CPD, and just a little bit of background to give you a flavor of the United States. So there is, each state has a board of pharmacy that regulates pharmacy practice. And so you'll see variations in pharmacy practice within each state. So it's no one state is the same. No two states are the same in terms of pharmacy practice. We are regulated by the National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, or NABP, and they do require a national board examination for initial licensure. But then if you're practicing in a particular state, you have to take that state's law exam to be licensed within that state. And we currently don't have a national requirement for CPD. We do have a national requirement for continuing education, and the amount of continuing education that is required to maintain your license varies depending, again, on the state in which you reside. And so, as Brett mentioned, I served on the Board of Pharmacy for 10 years, and I happen to be the chair of our continuing pharmacy education committee. And in 2009, we were tasked to review our current continuing education requirements. And specifically, we were tasked to determine if a portion of pharmacist CPE requirements should include live continuing education, such as this session, a webinar with you live. And then should continuing medical education be allowed or accepted as a continuing pharmacy education requirement to meet our continuing education requirement. And then should we look at specific continuing education requirements? And at that time, it was with regard to medication or patient safety. And then we were also tasked to begin looking into continuing professional development as a model for maintaining competence. And so this is our current CE requirements. Well, actually, at the time that we were embarking on our mission as a committee, these were the current CE requirements. And it depended on your pharmacist practice. So here in New Mexico, we're somewhat unique, at least at this time, we were somewhat unique in terms of having different types of pharmacist practice. So everybody, every pharmacist is a registered licensed pharmacist. And as such, we renew our license every 2 years. And we are required to obtain 30 hours of continuing pharmacy education every 2 years for relicensure. And in those 30 hours, you must have 2 hours in New Mexico pharmacy law review. There are pharmacists with prescriptive authority. And so they have the same CE requirements, 30 hours of CPE, but then they are required to obtain 2 additional hours of continuing pharmacy education for each area of prescriptive authority that they practice. And so at this time, back in 2009, there were 3 areas of prescriptive authority: 1, vaccines, emergency contraception, and then for tobacco cessation products. And so a pharmacist would, if they practice all 3 of those areas, they would have to have 30 hours of CE for their registered pharmacist license, and then 6 hours, 2 in each one of those therapeutic areas, to maintain their prescriptive authority. And then we have a third type of pharmacist, and that's the pharmacist clinician. And so you have to be a licensed pharmacist, but then you get additional licensure to become a pharmacist clinician. I happen to be a pharmacist clinician as well. And that's a pharmacist with prescriptive authority as outlined in a approved protocol that's approved by a supervising physician. And so the CE requirements for the pharmacist clinician are the same as the registered pharmacist, 30 hours, but then an additional 20 hours of continuing education. And that can either be continuing medical education or continuing pharmacy education. So a total of 50 hours every 2 years for licensure as the pharmacist clinician. And so we did some research, and what we came up with in terms of changes to meet our tasks were, we did recommend that a portion of the 30 hours of CE for the registered pharmacists be live continuing education. But we opted to include continuing medical education, so CME, as well as continuing pharmacy education to meet that 10-hour live requirement. And then we also recommended that 2 of the 30 hours be in the subject area of patient safety. In terms of the pharmacists with prescriptive authority, we did not make any changes. This is just to show you that there are now 6 areas in which pharmacists can obtain prescriptive authority. And this is independent prescriptive authority based on a protocol that has been approved by the Board of Pharmacy, Board of Medicine, and our Board of Nursing in New Mexico. And so currently there's vaccines. Now emergency contraception has been expanded to include hormonal contraception, naloxone therapy for opioid overdose prevention, and then point of care testing specific to HIV post-exposure prophylaxis therapy, and then tobacco cessation, and then the last area of prescriptive authority is tuberculin skin testing. There was no changes to the CE requirements for the pharmacist clinicians. So as I mentioned, the other thing that we were tasked to do was to review the whether or not we should embark on CPD. And so we started to look at CE, what is the evidence that CE can maintain competence? And not very good. And so that's why all the agencies are calling for a change from continuing education to a CPD process. I like this slideshow, this picture showing the traditional CE deliveries where you go to a conference, you sit in a big conference hall, and this is a quote from a pharmacist. You go, you sit, you listen, but then, well, I at least forget. And so I think that happens to a lot of us. And that goes along with the way we learn. And so this is Dale's cone of learning. And more of the passive forms of learning, we don't really retain that information. So things we read, things we hear, the traditional modes of continuing education, either reading or listening, have very, very low amount of retention of learning. Whereas the more active forms where you're actually participating in a discussion, say a journal club with your peers or colleagues, talking to your peers about a new medication, for example, in giving a presentation, maybe an in-service to your staff or to other providers. And then just from your patients, real life, you learn so much more. It's a much more active process, and then you retain that. And so that really is CPE. And so we found that continuing education can be effective for both learning and practice change if the activity is in an area of interest or preference to the learner, if it's related to their daily practice, if it's selected in response to an identified need, maybe a drug information question or a question from a patient, if it's interactive or hands-on, if it uses more than one intervention, and it's offering a continuation of learning. And if it's self-directed, it's something that you identified that you need in your practice. And then if it includes a commitment to change, importantly. And so all of this is really CPD. And so that led our committee to recommend that our board begin a CPD pilot project. And so we did. And the goal, the rationale for the project was, the ongoing improvement of knowledge, skills, attitudes, and judgment or competency of New Mexico pharmacists, while meeting professional standards, addressing public safety, and promoting self-regulation, and of course, complying with state regulations. And the goals of our CPD project were to encourage self-regulation of professional competency, self-directed regulation, and then acknowledge variations in practice settings. Everybody has different practice settings, so no CE, one CE is going to fit everybody's practice. Provide opportunities for pharmacists to self-assess their practice and what their own learning needs are. And then accept diversity in learning styles. Some people like to sit and listen to experts, but others like to read on their own, or maybe go out and research the information themselves. But assist our pharmacists in developing learning plans, and then meet individual practice needs for education. So our initial plan for our pilot, it was a 2-year time frame, and we hope to recruit 100 pharmacists with very diverse, hopefully a diverse group of pharmacists consisting of rural areas and urban areas, community pharmacists, hospital pharmacists, as well as the pharmacist clinician, new practitioners and not so new or seasoned practitioners. We had hoped to provide an electronic portfolio for our participants to document their learning activities and learning records. And then we had also hoped to incorporate a peer review system in which the learning plans and records would be double-blind reviewed by a peer, with the option for a participant to self-select an unblinded reviewer to review their materials. The initial plan also included no change in the number of required hours. And so those would be the same for the different types of pharmacy practice. And then no change for specific CE requirements or continuing pharmacy education requirements, such as pharmacy law, patient safety. And then effective in 2015, in response to the opioid epidemic, the board also required CE or at least 2 hours of CE of opioid safety. What did change is the types of learning activities that were accepted. So it could still be accredited CE, continuing education. Our accreditation is ACPE, Accreditation Council in Pharmaceutical Education. Or it could include non-accredited hours, and that's the big change. And so it could be something that the pharmacist maybe went off and reviewed the material themselves, read a journal article, read evidence-based guidelines, had a journal club. Could be live or self-study, could be formal or informal. It could be spontaneous, which most learning activities are spontaneous. We learn from our practice, or it could be a planned opportunity, planned learning session. And then we did require learning records for each learning activity. This just shows you the CPD cycle that we were using with our pharmacists, starting with self-assessment, where the pharmacist would take their own personal inventory of competency given their current practice and identify areas of need, and or perhaps they were wanting to change their practice. And so they would identify what would be needed from a knowledge and skill set to change their practice. And then develop a learning plan based on that self-assessment using SMART. We call them SMART learning objectives: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound learning objectives. And then document the learning activities. So go on and go out and take part of these learning activities to accomplish your learning plan, and then evaluate and reflect on those learning activities. Did they accomplish what you needed to? And then, of course, the whole cycle starts again with self-assessment. And so, unfortunately, we didn't have an electronic platform, and so we had to use a paper-based platform. So we had a learning plan that pharmacists would keep or use. This was not mandatory; they didn't have to turn this in. But they would develop their own learning plan for the year or 2 years, in which, what did they want to learn? What did they want to accomplish? And then they had to keep a learning record for each of those learning activities. And so the important part of the learning record is the evaluation and reflection process. And we always say the what did you want to learn? And did you learn it? And then so what? How will this how will this learning impact your practice? And then the now what? So what changes did you make? Or what else do you need to learn now? And then we wanted them to check off an outcome. How did this change their practice, or did it not? Did they need more learning? And then we did require keeping a CPD log, and whether it's an accredited or non-accredited activity, we wanted to see what they were doing. And this is what would be turned in to the Board of Pharmacy, is this log. And so what happened, we did start the pilot in 2011. Unfortunately, we only recruited 54 pharmacists for this initial 2-year phase. And the majority of the pharmacists were urban here in the Albuquerque area, and the majority were hospital pharmacists and pharmacist clinicians. And then we did have a good mixture of new practitioners of the 54 pharmacists versus the seasoned pharmacists. As I mentioned, we did not have an electronic portfolio. And so the pharmacists were required to keep their paper-based logs. And then we also were not able to implement the peer review system because that was really hinging on our electronic portfolio. And so we just did not implement that. We did conduct a focus group at the end of the 2 years of the participants to see, learn from them. They had a lot of positives with the CPD process. The learning plans and activities were more specific to their practice setting. They liked that it provided credit, CE credit, for work-related learning activities. They felt like the evaluation and reflection process added to even the traditional continuing education activities that they participated in. And it was easier to obtain the required credit hours. In fact, many of them went well over the required hours, 30 hours, again, for registered pharmacists, 50 hours for the pharm clinician, and most of them were going into the 70, 80 hours. The negatives, it takes more time, to document and reflect on CE. It takes much more time than traditional CE. The paper-based system, they didn't like. It's not convenient, particularly for spontaneous learning activities at work. And then you forget some of those spontaneous learning activities if you wouldn't document it right away. And so what they wanted was a web-based platform that could be accessed with mobile devices so they could utilize it during work. If licensed in multiple states, as I mentioned, each state has different requirements. And so if you're participating in the CPD pilot, other states might not recognize that. In fact, they wouldn't recognize that, but they would still require the accredited continuing education. And so that was a major holdup for individuals with licenses in multiple states. With all that said, the CPD pilot was renewed by our Board of Pharmacy with no expiration date. And so I guess you wouldn't even call it a pilot anymore. It's now a CPD opportunity. So pharmacists can opt into the CPD process or the traditional continuing education requirement. In terms of future, where do we go from here? We really want to gain access to a web-based platform because we think that would make it easier for our pharmacists to document and participate in the CPD program. We want to start recruiting again for participation. We haven't recruited really since the end of the pilot. And so we want to really go out and to our state professional society meetings and offer programming around CPD, but also encourage participation. I think what would help to drive the process is if our large employers, our large hospitals, our large community pharmacy chains would incorporate CPD into the annual review process. And that way you're somewhat killing two birds with one stone, and that you can satisfy your assurance of competency, but also building it into your annual review and career growth ladder. And then from a board perspective, they have right now no way of knowing who's participating in the CPD process versus regular traditional CE. And so unless they audit the pharmacists. So they would, going forward, we probably will require, they will probably require CPD pharmacists to submit a learning log for license renewal so they know who's participating in the CPD process. Here at the University of New Mexico College of Pharmacy, we are actually this fall beginning incorporating CPD into our first year Doctor of Pharmacy curriculum. And then the idea is that this will be scaffolded through the 4 years of our curriculum, and the students will use this in their introductory pharmacy practice experiences, co-curricular activities, and then in their advanced pharmacy practice experiences. The whole idea is to inculcate our students into the CPD process. And so the goal is that upon graduation, hopefully our students are very familiar with this process, very comfortable with the process, and then will participate in CPD as practitioners. To that end, we did, the College of Pharmacy, we did contract with an alum who developed a web-based CPD documentation program. And so we're hopeful that will help with pharmacists documenting. It's mobile phone-based as well. And we're going to offer this not just to our students, but also to our faculty as well as our preceptors to utilize this. The Accreditation Council for Pharmacy Education supports CPD. They're the ones that accredit continuing education, but they are very supportive of the CPD process and are encouraging states, other states, to develop CPD programs for their licensees. And so they have a tremendous amount of resources at this website regarding CPD. And they have now developed a CPD mobile-based platform that is offered through the NABP, National Association of Boards of Pharmacy, through their CP Monitor Plus program. It is a fee. There's a slight fee. It's $12 a year, so $1 a month to be able to use this system. And so this is relatively new. I just found out about this, and so this is a good thing. This would be helpful for our pharmacists to utilize, as well as the NMCPD platform that we created. And with that, Brett, I think we're at the end of our program for questions now, right?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Joe. It was great to hear just what your journey has been on for New Mexico, moving from clinical education through to continuing professional development. We'll stay tuned to see how it progresses from there as well. So thank you very much for sharing your journey with us. It was great. And I might just call on all presenters to come back to us. So Trish and Michael and Carine as well. With that, as we have a look at some questions that have been posted in the box for us, the Q&A box, and answer some of those. So just putting it out there, folks, you can put small questions in the Q&A box. Don't hesitate to do that. Please feel free. But there's a couple of questions there. One particularly around looking at the New Zealand experience. So Michael and Trish, looking at what the next steps might be in terms of what the council might do if a verifier does not provide a positive assessment of a pharmacist. What obligation is there on the verifier to report substandard practice, that type of thing? So in your new framework, what do you see the role of the verifier, and also what will the council do depending on what sort of report the verifier provides?
I think we tossed a coin and I won or lost this one. When the new framework was brought in, one of the areas of highest concern for the profession was the role of the verifier and any liability that verifier may have in the event that the pharmacist they verified for went on to have competence issues, for example. And so, council was extremely clear that the role of the verifier was specifically to have conversations with that person and to basically to verify that the sort of CPD that had been undertaken by the pharmacist was relevant to their practice. So that's why you generally would expect the verifier to be working in a similar area of practice. So they were there to provide that kind of feedback to the pharmacist and make that kind of statement to council. They weren't attesting that this person, in their view, was competent and fit to practice as a pharmacist, was relevant to their area of practice. However, under our Act, under the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act, there is an obligation on all registered health professionals, all practicing pharmacists, that if they were to identify a practitioner about whom they had serious concerns regarding their competence, so that they have an obligation to notify council of that concern. So there is a mechanism by which they would do that, but it wouldn't be the intent of the My Recert or their role as a verifier for that to come through that, if that makes sense. Anything else, Michael, that I needed to add?
I think your internet might have dropped a little bit, Trish, and I think at a very critical moment. So I might just very quickly summarize. So in effect, we're saying the verifier is verifying that the pharmacist is undertaking appropriate professional development relevant to their practice. They are not verifying that they are competent. However, as Trish also alluded to, under our health practitioners' competence assurance, for all health practitioners, there is a legal obligation for any health practitioner to advise the relevant council, so the medical council or the pharmacy council, to advise us if there is some issue in the practice of a health practitioner.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Trish. I'm going to expand that question a little bit and go to Carine. Carine, in your 6-year new accreditation framework that you're looking at introducing, is that something that you thought of in terms of what you might do when in the 6 years, if it isn't achieved, the re-accreditation isn't achieved, what might be the processes of then helping people? Is it around re-education? Is it about what are you aiming to do if they don't reach the recertification in that 6-year program?
Well, that's a very good question. I must say, I don't have the answer right now because for the certification program, the work is in progress. But I can say that, for instance, what is happening for the DPC, the CPD, the only thing is like we're trying to encourage and help the pharmacists to fulfill their obligation. But what we can see sometimes is that we lack, we miss some programs and some, for instance, from some training program. And I know that some pharmacists would like to fulfill their obligation, but there is not enough offer on the market to do training or other programs. So sometimes it's not only the pharmacists that don't want, it's also the offers that are not enough on the market. So to answer your question, that's probably something we can do better, is make sure that everything is made possible for the pharmacist to fulfill the obligation, to encourage him. And then at the end, there might be some sanctions, like disciplinary sanction. That's eventually something that would be probably necessary also.
Yeah, no, thanks. Thanks, Carine. I've got a question there for Joe then too. Joe, just a slightly different question. Could you elaborate on the rationale for giving the option to self-select an unbiased peer reviewer? And would you be making a determination of being unbiased? Is that a space? Because I know you said you were reviewing the peer reviewing. What were your thoughts around peer review?
Yeah, I think it would function similar to the New Zealand verifier, really. And that would be to just offer their review of the pharmacist learning plan, and then their learning, records and activities. Were they achieving their learning plan? And then was that learning plan appropriate for that pharmacist's particular practice? Unbiased would be, having them blinded would introduce the, minimize hopefully the bias. The other problem with the small number of participants we had, that was another reason why we didn't introduce the peer review, because it was hard to maintain anonymity with only 54 participants. We're a big state geographically, 4th largest state in the country, but a very small population. And so it seems like all the pharmacists know everybody in the state. So it wouldn't be hard to figure that out. But yeah, the peer review would serve much the purpose of the verifier that New Zealand was proposing. And we would definitely like to introduce that process.
Well, thanks, mate, for sharing. And I'm going to take the privilege of being moderator and ask a question of my own for you. We all know the benefits of continuing professional development, and talking about making it mandatory for pharmacists to meet their obligations. But then inside that is a separate set of, do we make particular particular continuing professional development activities mandatory, like cultural competence, like first aid training, like things like that. And I know, Joe, you talked about it a little bit, depending on what setting they're working in, there's some specific activities that you've mandated around that in New Mexico. In New Zealand and France, just going to Michael, for you first, what are your views on mandating specific activities for pharmacists to complete in their continuing professional development journey?
We think it's a good idea. Cultural competency has been compulsory and is once again one of the activities in our new program that we are expecting these activities to be undertaken. It does help focus, and as we use increasingly business intelligence amongst the data that we gather, helping to target where the greatest harm is, understanding what cohort of pharmacists may be operating in those areas, it's then very useful to be able to target activities or programs to that cohort, if you like, and therefore hopefully help mitigate the risk and protect the pharmacist as a measure of that as well. So yes is the short answer to your question.
Thanks, Michael. And a short answer from you, Carine. What do you think from a France's point of view? Do you believe mandating particular specific activities is worthwhile, or leaving it completely up to the pharmacists? You're on mute, sorry, Carine.
Sorry for that.
That's right.
So yes, definitely, that would be also a very interesting point and something to definitely put in place in the near future.
And I think probably, I know your answer, Joe, or from a New Mexico's point of view in terms of that.
Yeah, I agree. It's a difficult thing. You don't want to be so prescriptive with your CE, but I think that's the beauty of CPD. Is that if you say a broad area like patient safety or cultural competency or opioid safety, CPD gives a lot of leeway to what that would mean for that particular pharmacist in terms of that training. So I do like having some guidance with regard to the CE, but not being so prescriptive, but a little bit is okay to address.
It's really about them looking at what their gaps are, what they think they need to upskill themselves with, and sort of finding out what are the continuing professional development requirements around that, what programs are available they can use to improve themselves in terms of that, isn't it? So it's giving them the scope to be able to do that, but also say, look, there are some really important things that we think need to be covered as well, as you mentioned, Michael, around the cultural competency and that sort of thing too.
But we don't dictate how people learn that or what they have to learn. We're just saying take an action towards improving your cultural competence. So it's sufficiently flexible, I think, for people to work out the most important learning for them, but it's covering off learning in that particular area.
So as Joe says, not being so prescriptive, Trish is saying number of hours, this is what you've got to do, but you've got to do some activity around it.
Yeah.
Terrific. Look, I want to thank all of you. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. It's absolutely terrific and really appreciate the time that you've given. Hopefully everyone has also learned a lot from around the globe of what's happening in different countries around continuing professional development and re-accreditation. Just to go through just a couple of things before we go, just to highlight some of the important FIP events that are happening in the future. We've got the FIP Pharmacy Practice Research Summer Meeting for PhD students, postdoctoral fellows and supervisors on the 4th and 5th of July in Utrecht in Netherlands. So don't forget that, mark that on your calendar. And the other one as well, just to highlight, and of course, very important, is the 80th FIP World Congress in Seville, in Spain, on the 18th to the 22nd of September, with the theme of Pharmacy United in the Recovering of Healthcare. So please don't forget that. There's some program topics just to tell you of some of those important things that will be discussed at the World Congress around never waste a crisis, learnings for future preparedness, science and evidence supporting the response to COVID-19, and dealing with and coping with extraordinary ethical challenges. So that'll be all there. The information there is at events.fip.org. Please go there to check out all the things that are happening in this space. Again, thank you very much, everyone, for being with us. Our time is finished. I hope you really enjoyed the webinar and we've enjoyed presenting it to you. Thank you very much for attending, everybody. Good night or good morning, good day, wherever you might be around the world. Thank you very much from Australia. Thank you, everybody.